August 18th, 1945. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The afternoon sun pressed down on the dusty courtyard like a weight. Harumi Tanaka, 19 years old, pressed her back against the wooden barracks wall. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Across the compound, Captain Yoshida walked toward them, his face carved from stone, his prisoner uniform doing nothing to diminish the authority that radiated from every step. And then the screaming started. Before we continue this remarkable story, please like and subscribe. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories from the greatest generation. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. The women's screams cut through the humid Mississippi air like broken glass, high-pitched, desperate, filled with terror that transcended language. Some dropped to their knees. Others clutched each other, trembling violently. Harumi watched her former commander approach and in that moment understood what the other women had already realized. The Americans had promised protection, but promises meant nothing when your own commander stood before you. Men who had distributed cyanide capsules before the final battles. Men who had said death was better than surrender. Men who were now here to enforce that code. And then the American soldiers moved. They formed a line between the advancing officers and the terrified women. Rifles held across their chests, not aimed at anyone, but creating an unmistakable barrier. The sergeant spoke in broken Japanese. "Dame, Hikama-san. No, you cannot go." Harumi stopped breathing. The enemy was protecting them from their own people. And in that instant, she realized everything she had been taught about this war was a lie. But to understand how she arrived at this impossible moment, we must go back 3 months. Back to when Harumi Tanaka believed she would die with honor. Back to the day the world ended, April 1st, 1945. Okinawa. The American invasion began at dawn with a sound like the earth tearing itself apart. Artillery shells screamed overhead, each one a promise of death, delivered with mechanical precision. The communications post where Harumi worked shook with each impact. Dust rained from the ceiling. Papers flew from desks. Radio equipment crackled with static and desperate voices. She was 20 years old, a radio operator for the Imperial Japanese Army Women's Auxiliary Corps. Not a soldier officially, but she wore a uniform, lived under military discipline, had been told her work was sacred, that death in service was the highest honor a woman could achieve. She had believed it all. Harumi came from Yokohama from a modest middle-class family that had been slowly devoured by the war. Her father had died in Manchuria in '39 when she was 13. Her mother, Emiko, still lived in Yokohama, enduring the bombing raids with the stoic acceptance of a woman who had already lost too much to fear losing more. Her brother Kenji, 22 years old, was training as a kamikaze pilot somewhere in Kyushu. His letters arrived irregularly, carefully censored, but she could read between the lines. He was proud, resolved, ready to die for the emperor. The war had seemed distant when Harumi was growing up. Something happening in China, something the soldiers talked about in low voices. Then came Pearl Harbor, then the declarations, then the mobilization, then the draft notices that came for everyone. The military had taken her in '42 when she was 17. Sent her to Manila first, then to Okinawa as American forces drew closer. 3 years of intercepting enemy transmissions, relaying orders, maintaining communication lines. 3 years of believing Japan was winning. 3 years of propaganda that painted Americans as demons. Now the demons were here, and they were destroying everything. Through the broken window of the communications post, Harumi could see civilians fleeing through the streets, old people stumbling over rubble, children screaming for parents who could not hear them. A woman in a tattered kimono ran past clutching an infant. Shrapnel from an explosion caught them both. They fell together, did not get up. Something cracked inside Harumi's chest, a small fracture in the wall of belief she had built around herself. These were her people dying. Not soldiers, just people. The propaganda had never shown her this. By mid-April, everyone knew the battle was lost. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Supply lines had been cut weeks ago. There was no food, no water, no medicine. Just the slow grinding reality that the Americans were going to win, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. And then came the order everyone had been dreading. Prepare for the final stand. Lieutenant Watanabe, her commanding officer, gathered the women in what remained of the communications center. His face was gray. His hands shook as he opened a wooden box. Inside were glass capsules, small, innocuous looking, each one containing cyanide. You will take these rather than fall into enemy hands. That is your duty. That is what honor demands. He distributed them methodically, one to each woman. Harumi took hers with numb fingers. It felt impossibly heavy in her palm. This tiny glass capsule containing oblivion, containing the end of everything she was and everything she might have been. When the Americans come, you will take it immediately. You understand what they will do to you if you are captured. You understand the degradation, the violation. Death is mercy compared to what awaits you in their hands. Harumi believed him. Why would she not? She had been told for years that Americans were monsters, that they raped and tortured and killed for sport. That surrender meant suffering worse than death. The capsule sat in her pocket for 3 days like a stone. On April 15th, the Americans breached their position. Harumi heard them before she saw them. Boots pounding, English voices shouting, the metallic click of weapons being readied. She was in the communications room with 3 other women when the door burst open. Her hand went to her pocket, found the capsule. Her fingers closed around it. This was the moment. This was when she was supposed to show her loyalty, her courage, her honor. She unscrewed the cap. The young American soldier pointing his rifle at her looked terrified. His face was pale. His hands shook. He shouted something in terrible Japanese, hands up. His voice cracked with what sounded almost like fear. Harumi stared at him, at this enemy, this demon, this monster who was supposed to torture her. He looked like a boy, barely older than her brother, scared out of his mind. And her hand would not move. Her fingers would not lift the capsule to her lips. Her body operating on some instinct deeper than training, deeper than propaganda, deeper than honor, simply refused to die. The soldier stepped closer, gestured frantically with his rifle. Out. Go out. She raised her hands, slowly. The capsule fell from her fingers and rolled across the floor, disappearing under a desk. She had failed her duty, failed her country, failed the code she had been raised to uphold. But she was alive. The soldier herded her outside at gunpoint. In the street, she found 30 other women huddled under American guard. Some were crying, others stood in shocked silence, faces blank with trauma. A medic moved among them, checking for injuries, offering water from a green campus canteen. Water. From the enemy. When it was Harumi's turn, she was too thirsty to refuse. She took the canteen with shaking hands and drank. The water was clean and cold. It tasted real. It tasted like life. She tried not to think about what it meant that the Americans were giving her water instead of death. Beside her, another woman whispered, Sachiko, a 25-year-old nurse with intelligent eyes and a cynical mouth. They are going to kill us all, just slower, make us suffer first. But the Americans did not look like men planning torture. They looked tired, bored. One young private kept glancing at a photograph he pulled from his pocket. A girl, maybe his sister, maybe a sweetheart. He looked at it, then at the Japanese prisoners, then back at the photograph, his face troubled. They were loaded onto trucks and driven to the coast. American ships waited there, massive and gray, floating in water that reflected the sky like metal. The gangway seemed impossibly steep as Harumi climbed aboard. Around her, women whispered prayers and apologies to the dead they had failed to join. But death did not come. Instead came seasickness, the roll of waves, the smell of diesel fuel and salt water, and impossibly food. The mess hall on the ship served dinner at 1800 hours. Harumi stood in line with the other prisoners, each woman taking a tray, each woman staring at what appeared on those trays with expressions of disbelief. Rice, yes, but also meat, bread, canned vegetables, fruit, more food than Harumi had seen in 6 months. Her hands shook as she carried her tray to a long table. It is poison, Sachiko whispered beside her. They will kill us slowly. But as hours passed and no one died, hunger won out over fear. Harumi ate. The food tasted real. Her stomach accepted it without protest. This realization brought no comfort, only deeper confusion. If the Americans wanted them dead, why feed them? If they wanted them to suffer, Why give them beds with thin mattresses and scratchy blankets that were nonetheless clean? The voyage lasted 2 weeks across Pacific waters that stretched to every horizon. They sailed toward a country Harumi knew only through lies. America, they had been told, was a land of demons. Its people were cruel and barbaric. Its soldiers were monsters without conscience or mercy. Yet the soldiers guarding them seemed mostly bored and tired. Some were young, barely older than Harumi herself. They played cards during breaks, shared cigarettes, told jokes in English that made each other laugh. They did not look like monsters. They looked like boys who wanted to go home. The prisoners quickly sorted themselves into types. There was Tomoko, 21 years old, a true believer who refused American food for the first 3 days. She quoted the Bushido Code, insisted the war was not truly lost, called the other women traitors for accepting enemy kindness. There was Sachiko, the pragmatic nurse who had lost her fiancé at Iwo Jima. She was the first to eat, the first to laugh at her own situation. The first to admit that perhaps everything they had been told was a lie. There was young Akiko, just 17, who cried every night and looked to the older women for guidance. There was Midori, a former schoolteacher who tried to maintain Japanese discipline and hierarchy even in captivity. There was Kazuko from Tokyo, whose family might be dead in the firebombing, whose eyes held a blankness that spoke of loss beyond words. And there was Harumi, caught in the middle, unable to accept Tomoko's blind faith, unable to embrace Sachiko's complete rejection, just confused, scared, trying to make sense of a world that had stopped making sense the moment that American soldier's voice cracked with fear instead of hate. On the 14th day, someone shouted from above deck. The prisoners were not allowed topside, but word spread quickly through whispers and gestures. Land, America, San Francisco. Harumi pressed her face against the small porthole in the hold, watched as morning fog lifted to reveal something impossible. The Golden Gate Bridge. It rose through the mist like something from a dream, enormous and red and utterly impossible. She had never imagined such a structure could exist. The propaganda had told them America was primitive, crude, barely industrial. But this bridge spoke of engineering prowess that made her homeland's achievements look small by comparison. As the ship drew closer, she saw the city beyond. San Francisco spread across hills, buildings gleaming in morning light, intact, whole. Not a single bomb structure, not a crater or ruin in sight. Cars moved through streets. People walked on sidewalks. Streetcars ran on rails that caught the sun. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Japan had told them America was being destroyed by the war, that American cities were burning, that their people were starving, that victory was inevitable because the enemy was collapsing. But here was a city untouched, prosperous, alive in ways Japanese cities had not been for years. Everything was a lie, not a small lie, not an exaggeration, a complete inversion of reality. Harumi started crying and could not stop. Around her, other women saw what she saw. Some began to cry as well. Others just stared in shocked silence. Even Tomoko, who had been insisting the war was not truly lost, fell quiet. Sachiko touched Harumi's shoulder, whispered the question they were all thinking. If America looks like this, what does Japan look like now? No one had an answer, but they all knew. Bombed, burning, starving, dying. While America stood whole and strong and utterly undiminished by a war that had consumed everything Japan had. They were loaded onto buses, driven south and east through landscapes so vast Harumi could barely process them. California gave way to Arizona. Endless desert, rock formations that looked like sculptures carved by ancient gods. Arizona gave way to New Mexico. More desert but different. Red earth, blue sky, space so enormous it made her feel like an insect. New Mexico gave way to Texas. And suddenly there were fields. Fields that stretched to horizons so distant they seemed to curve with the earth itself. Cattle grazed in pastures larger than entire Japanese villages. Towns appeared and disappeared, each with shops and houses that looked like they belonged in some fantasy of abundance. How can they have so much? Sachiko whispered beside her. The question hung unanswered, because the answer was too terrible to speak aloud. America had so much because they had always had so much, because the war had barely touched them, because Japan had been fighting an enemy so far beyond their capacity to defeat that the very premise of the war had been insane. By the time the buses reached Mississippi, the women had fallen into stunned silence. Everything they had been told was a lie, not propaganda that exaggerated or spun truth, just pure fiction. Japan had been crushed. America had barely been scratched. The war they thought they were winning had been lost from the first day. Camp Shelby sat in pine forest south of Hattiesburg, a sprawling complex of barracks and administrative buildings surrounded by fences. As the buses rolled through the gates, Harumi felt her fear return with fresh intensity. This was a prison. They were prisoners. Whatever kindness they had been shown, surely this was where it would end. The buses stopped. Guards ordered them out. They filed into a processing center where American soldiers with clipboards checked their names against lists. Then came the moment they had been dreading. Delousing, said one soldier in halting Japanese. He pointed toward a building from which steam was rising. The women looked at each other, terror spreading like wildfire through the group. Delousing meant showers. Showers meant being naked before the enemy. Showers meant vulnerability and shame, and the violations they had been promised were coming. Some women began to cry. Others stood rigid, faces blank with shock. This was it. This was where the kindness ended and the nightmare began. Harumi's legs felt like water. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. But inside, they found only female American staff. No men. The showers were in private stalls. They were given soap that smelled of lavender, towels clean and white, hot water poured from the shower heads, washing away weeks of travel and fear and the accumulated grime of war. Harumi stood under the stream and felt something break inside her. Not from cruelty, from its opposite. From hot water and privacy and soap that smelled like flowers. From dignity when she had been expecting degradation. The water was hot, really hot, hot enough to steam, hot enough to turn her skin pink. She had not felt hot water in months. In Okinawa, there had been no hot water, no clean water, just buckets of tepid liquid that tasted like rust and fear. She stood under that shower and cried. Not quiet tears, deep racking sobs that shook her whole body. Cried for Kenji, who might fly his suicide mission. Cried for her mother, who might be dead in Yokohama. Cried for all the lies. Cried for the 3 years she had spent believing those lies. Cried for the girl she had been, who had thought honor meant death. Around her, other women were crying too. The sound echoed off the tile walls. A chorus of grief and confusion and relief and shame all mixed together into something that had no name. After showers, they received clean cotton dresses and practical shoes. They were led to barracks where beds waited, each with sheets and a pillow and a thin blanket. Basic, sparse, military in its efficiency, but clean, organized. Nothing like the degradation they had been promised. Harumi chose a bunk near the window, sat on the edge of the mattress. The springs creaked under her weight. She touched the pillow. It was real, stuffed with something soft. She pulled back the blanket. The sheets were white, slightly rough, smelled like soap. That night, lying in her bunk, Harumi listened to other women whisper in the darkness. What do they want from us? Why are they treating us this way? It is a trick. They will interrogate us, torture us. This is just to make us soft. But what information do we have? I am just a nurse. They want to break our spirits, make us forget we are Japanese. Or maybe they are just showing us mercy. Mercy from the enemy. That makes no sense. Nothing makes sense anymore. The whispers faded. One by one, the women fell silent, exhausted, confused, but alive, fed, clean, safe in a way they had not been safe in months. Harumi pulled the thin blanket up to her chin and stared at the ceiling. In the darkness, she could just make out the wooden beams above. American wood. American nails. American builders who had constructed this barracks for American soldiers now housing Japanese prisoners. In her pocket, pressed against her hip, was a letter from her brother Kenji, written months ago, delivered before she left Okinawa. She had read it so many times she knew it by heart. Death is honor. Surrender is shame. If you are captured, you know what you must do. Do not bring disgrace to our family. Die with dignity. That is the only way. But she had not died. She had dropped the capsule, raised her hands, chosen life over honor. Was she a coward? The thought circled in her mind like a bird that could not land. Or perhaps whispered a small voice in the back of her consciousness. Perhaps courage was not dying when told to die. Perhaps courage was surviving. Perhaps courage was admitting that everything she had been taught was wrong. Perhaps the real cowardice was clinging to lies because admitting the truth was too painful. Tomorrow would bring more confusion, more kindness from the enemy, more evidence that the world was not what she had believed. But tonight, exhausted and clean and safe, Harumi closed her eyes and let sleep take her. Her last thought before darkness claimed her was simple and terrifying. If the Americans are not monsters, then who are we? What does that make the people who told us they were? What does that make the war itself? She fell asleep with those questions unanswered. Outside, American guards walked their patrols. In the distance, she could hear male voices, singing, American songs she did not recognize. The words were foreign, but the melody was strangely beautiful. Somewhere in Mississippi, in the deep heart of enemy territory, Harumi Tanaka slept in a clean bed with a full stomach. And in her dreams, she stood under hot water that washed away more than dirt. It washed away certainty. It washed away the easy answers. It washed away the girl who had believed everything her country told her. When she woke, she would be someone different. Someone who had seen the bridge. Someone who had tasted the food. Someone who had felt the hot water. Someone who was beginning to understand that mercy could come from unexpected places. Someone who was beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, survival was not the same as surrender. That maybe living was not the same as failing. That maybe the greatest courage was admitting you had been wrong. But that understanding would take time, would take days and weeks of watching Americans treat their prisoners with a dignity that should not have been possible, would take confrontations and revelations and moments of terror and moments of grace. For now, she slept. And in sleeping began the long journey from blind belief to confused understanding, from hatred to something more complicated, from certainty to doubt to eventually a new kind of truth. The journey had just begun, and tomorrow would bring the first real test. Tomorrow she would wake in an American prison camp. Tomorrow she would start to build a new life from the ruins of everything she had believed. Tomorrow the real story would begin. May 2nd, 1945, 6 o'clock in the morning. The bugle call shattered the pre-dawn silence like broken glass. Harumi jolted awake, her heart hammering, momentarily confused about where she was. Not Okinawa, not the ship. Somewhere else. Somewhere that smelled like pine wood and soap. American voices at the door. Not harsh, not cruel, just efficient and neutral. Formation. 5 minutes. The women scrambled into their cotton dresses, fingers fumbling with unfamiliar buttons. Harumi splashed water on her face from a basin near the door. The water was cold and clean and tasted like nothing, which after months of water that tasted like metal and death was itself a small miracle. Outside, they lined up in rows as American guards called their names from clipboards. The morning air was cool and heavy with moisture. Mist clung to the ground between the barracks. In the distance, Harumi could hear men's voices. American soldiers doing their own morning formation, singing cadences that sounded strange and rhythmic. This was her first full view of Camp Shelby in daylight. The compound was enormous. Rows of identical barracks stretched in every direction, painted the same dull green, each one exactly like the others. Guard towers stood at intervals, silhouetted against the lightning sky. Beyond the fences, pine forests stretched away into morning haze. This was not just a prison camp. This was a massive military training facility, and they were a small part of a much larger operation. After roll call, they were marched to the mess hall, a long wooden building with rows of tables and benches. The smell hit Harumi before she even entered. Bacon, coffee, toast, smells so rich and foreign they made her dizzy. American soldiers sat at some tables eating and talking. They glanced at the Japanese prisoners as they filed in, but mostly kept to themselves. No hostility, no hatred, just tired men eating breakfast before another day of work. The prisoners went through a serving line. A cook, a large black man with kind eyes and powerful forearms, spooned food onto metal trays. Scrambled eggs, strips of bacon, toast with butter already melting into the bread, a cup of coffee, an orange. Harumi took her tray with hands that shook slightly. This was more food than she had seen on a single plate in 6 months. More food than most Japanese civilians saw in a week. And this was just breakfast. Just a normal Thursday morning breakfast in an American military camp. The women sat together at long tables. For several minutes, no one spoke. They just stared at their trays. Some began to eat mechanically, faces blank. Others sat frozen, unable to make their hands move. Harumi picked up a strip of bacon. It was still hot. Grease glistened on the surface. She brought it to her mouth, bit down. The taste exploded across her tongue. Salt and fat and smoke, rich beyond anything she remembered. She chewed slowly, and to her surprise, tears began to run down her cheeks. Around her, other women were crying too. Not from sadness, from the cognitive dissonance of eating like this while knowing what their families were enduring. From shame at enjoying enemy food. From confusion at every single thing their lives had become. Sachiko sat beside her, eating steadily, her face a mask. But Harumi saw her hands shaking as she lifted her coffee cup. After breakfast came work assignments. A list was posted outside the mess hall. Harumi scanned it until she found her name. Administration building. Clerical work. Reported at Oko 700. Sachiko was assigned to the camp hospital as a medical assistant. Tomoko to the laundry facility. Young Akiko to kitchen detail. Midori, the former teacher, to the library. The administration building was a 2-story structure near the center of camp. Inside it smelled like paper and typewriter ink and floor polish. An American sergeant directed Harumi down a hallway to an office where a woman sat behind a desk covered in files and documents. The woman looked up as Harumi entered. She was middle-aged, perhaps 45, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her features suggested Chinese ancestry, but she wore an American dress and spoke with an American accent. "You must be Harumi Tanaka." Harumi nodded, understanding her name, but little else. The woman stood and extended her hand. "I am Mrs. Margaret Chen. You will work with me. We will manage together, even if we do not share language yet." She gestured to a chair beside the desk, then to stacks of files that needed organizing. Through gestures and demonstrations, she showed Harumi the system. Files sorted by name, then by date, then by type. Papers stamped, then filed, then logged in a ledger. The typewriter, its keys marked with letters Harumi recognized but could not read in context. Mrs. Chen was patient. When Harumi made mistakes, she simply showed her the correct way again. No frustration, no anger, no contempt. She treated Harumi like a person learning a job. Nothing more, nothing less. By midday, Harumi's head ached from concentration. Mrs. Chen noticed and brought 2 sandwiches from somewhere. Ham and cheese on white bread. She handed one to Harumi. "Eat. You are too thin." Not pity, just practical concern, the way you might tell someone their shoe was untied. The days began to blur into routine. Wake at 6, formation, breakfast, work from 7 until noon, lunch, work from 1 until 5, dinner, free time until lights out at 9. The same thing every day, week after week. Harumi learned the rhythm quickly, learned where to stand in formation, learned what the bugle calls meant, learned the route to the administration building and back, learned Mrs. Chen's filing system until she could do it without instruction, and slowly she began to learn English. Mrs. Chen would point to objects and say their names: file, typewriter, paper, stamp, desk, chair, pencil. Harumi would repeat the words, testing them on her tongue. Mrs. Chen would nod encouragement. Then Harumi began teaching Mrs. Chen basic Japanese. Arigato, hi, ie, ohayo. They would practice during breaks, pointing at things and naming them in both languages. A trade, a mutual exchange. 2 women from countries at war teaching each other how to communicate. It created a bond that surprised them both. But the evenings in the barracks were different. That was when the ideological battles began. The women would gather after dinner in the hour before lights out, sitting on bunks, voices low, hashing out what it all meant, what they were becoming, what they should believe. Tomoko led one faction, the true believers, those who could not let go of what they had been taught. "This is a trick," she would say, her voice tight with conviction. "They are softening us for interrogation, making us forget who we are, making us forget our duty. Some of you are starting to smile at them, starting to learn their language. You are betraying everything we stand for. Sachiko would shake her head. What information do we have that they want? You were in laundry. I was a field nurse. Harumi operated a radio. We know nothing valuable. They are not interrogating us. Then why the kindness, Tomoko demanded. Maybe because that is what civilized people do. Maybe because Americans actually believe their own propaganda about human dignity and individual rights. Maybe because they are just better at being human than we were told. The words hung in the air like smoke. Some women nodded slowly. Others looked away uncomfortable. Midori, the teacher, tried to find middle ground. We should maintain Japanese discipline among ourselves. But we should also learn from Americans. Understanding your enemy makes you stronger even in defeat. Harumi listened to these debates night after night, caught between extremes. Part of her wanted to believe Sachiko, wanted to accept that Americans were showing genuine mercy. But guilt gnawed at her. Guilt over surviving when others took the capsule. Guilt over enjoying the food while her family starved. Guilt over her brother Kenji still training to die. If I accept their kindness, does that betray Kenji? She asked Sachiko one night. Sachiko considered this. Your brother made his choice. You made yours. Neither of you is wrong. You are just trying to survive the same nightmare from different directions. But the division in the barracks grew deeper. Tomoko refused to learn English, refused to smile at guards, refused to acknowledge that anything good could come from America. She clung to the old code with desperate intensity, as if letting go meant admitting her entire life had been a lie, which of course it had been. One afternoon in late May, Harumi was working in the administration building when Mrs. Chen did something unexpected. She pulled open a desk drawer and removed a photograph, held it out to Harumi. The picture showed a young man in army uniform. Dark hair, serious eyes, a slight smile. My son, Mrs. Chen said slowly, making sure Harumi understood. David, he died last December, in France. Battle of the Bulge. She pulled out a map and pointed to a place in Europe, then made a gesture that needed no translation. Explosion. Death. Harumi stared at the photograph, then at Mrs. Chen. This woman had lost her son to the war. Her son had died fighting. Not Japanese soldiers, but Germans. But still, he had died in this war, the same terrible war that had consumed everyone. And yet Mrs. Chen worked with Japanese prisoners, taught them English, brought them sandwiches, showed them patience and respect. Harumi struggled to form the English words. Why? Why kind to me? Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled out a piece of paper and began to write in slow, clear English. She wrote several sentences, then used a dictionary to help Harumi understand. Hate does not bring him back. Hate only makes more death. Maybe healing can honor him better than revenge. Harumi read the words 3 times, felt something shift in her chest. This was not weakness. This was strength. This was choosing deliberately to be kind when you had every right to be cruel. This was what real courage looked like. She thought of Kenji, who believed courage meant flying into an American ship and exploding. She thought of Lieutenant Watanabe, who believed courage meant taking poison rather than surrender. She thought of all the people who had told her that death was the highest honor. But maybe they were wrong. Maybe the highest honor was this: living, healing, refusing to let hatred win. In early June, something happened that brought the ideological split to a breaking point. It started small. Young Akiko, working in the kitchen, received a letter from home. Her family was alive. Her mother, her 2 younger sisters. All alive, but starving. The letter described conditions in their village. Rice rations cut to almost nothing. Children with swollen bellies. Old people dying in the streets. Akiko read this letter and began to cry. Not quiet tears, deep racking sobs. Relief that her family lived. Grief that they suffered. Guilt that she was here eating eggs and bacon while they starved. An American Guard Sergeant Wilson saw her crying. He was young, perhaps 28, with a kind face and sad eyes. He approached, carefully pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, offered it to her. It was just a gesture of kindness. Just one human being seeing another in pain and responding with compassion. Akiko took the handkerchief, wiped her eyes, said in halting English, "Thank you," and smiled at him through her tears. Tomoko exploded. She had been walking past and saw the exchange. She strode over, grabbed Akiko's arm, pulled her away from Wilson. Then she turned on the younger woman with fury in her eyes. You smiled at the enemy. You flirt with the man who killed our soldiers. You take his handkerchief like a comfort woman. You have no shame, no honor. Akiko started crying harder, confused and frightened. Wilson took a step forward, not understanding the Japanese words, but understanding the tone. Hey, what is going on here, Harumi? Who had been nearby moved quickly. She stepped between Tomoko and Akiko. Stop. She is just a child. She was grateful for kindness. That is all. Tomoko turned her fury on Harumi. And you work for them. You learn their language. You eat at their tables. You have forgotten who you are. You have forgotten your duty. You have forgotten your honor. The words cut deep because part of Harumi feared they were true. But another part, a part that had been growing stronger each day, refused to accept that narrative anymore. No, Harumi said quietly. I remember exactly who I am. I am someone who wants to live. I am someone who is tired of being told that death is the only honorable choice. Maybe honor is surviving. Maybe honor is admitting we were lied to. Maybe the real cowardice is clinging to lies because admitting the truth hurts too much. The words hung in the humid air. Women had gathered around listening. Some nodded slowly. Others looked uncertain. Tomoko's face twisted with rage and something else. Desperation. Because if Harumi was right, then everything Tomoko had believed was false. And that was too terrible to accept. You are a traitor, Tomoko said. Her voice shook. No, I am just someone who chose to live. And I refuse to apologize for that anymore. Sachiko stepped forward, stood beside Harumi. So do I, then Midori, and I. Even young Akiko, wiping her eyes with Wilson's handkerchief, nodded. The barracks split that day, not evenly. Perhaps a third of the women sided with Tomoko. The rest, in various degrees, sided with Harumi. They did not all agree on everything, but they agreed on one thing. Survival was not shame. Living was not betrayal. And maybe, just maybe, accepting kindness from the enemy did not make you a traitor. It just made you human. That night, Harumi lay awake long after lights out. She thought about Mrs. Chen's son David, who died in France. She thought about Sergeant Wilson, who had offered a handkerchief to a crying enemy. She thought about the cook, who had given her extra bacon, the guards who treated them with neutral courtesy. The whole complex system of American mercy that should not exist but did. And she thought about Kenji, about her brother who believed death was honor, who was training right now to fly his plane into an American ship, who would die believing he was serving something noble. She wanted to write to him, wanted to tell him everything she had learned. But what could she say? That the Americans were not monsters, that surrender was not shame, that the war was lost and had been lost from the beginning. He would never believe her. He could not believe her, because his entire sense of self was built on those lies. And when you have built your identity on lies, the truth becomes the enemy. She fell asleep with tears on her cheeks. The next day, something happened that put their small conflicts in perspective. News arrived from Europe. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. American guards were jubilant, celebrating, shaking hands. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey and several men took celebratory swigs. There was talk of coming home soon, of the war being almost finished. The Japanese prisoners listened to this with growing dread. If all Allied resources were now focused on the Pacific, what did that mean for Japan, for their families, for any hope of avoiding total destruction? Midori translated what she could understand from English newspapers Mrs. Chen shared. The news was grim. Massive invasion of Japanese home islands being planned. Casualties estimated in the millions, both American and Japanese. A final battle that would dwarf everything that had come before. Some women felt a flicker of desperate hope. Maybe Japan could still win. Maybe if they fought hard enough, the Americans would give up. But most knew better. They had seen San Francisco, had ridden through America's heartland, had watched American abundance in industry. Japan could not win. Japan had never been able to win. The only question was how many would die before surrender. Through June and into July, the women settled into their routines. Work, meals, evening conversations that were less heated now that the camps had split into factions. Those who believed like Tomoko kept to themselves. Those who believed like Harumi and Sachiko formed their own group. Harumi's English improved steadily. She could now have simple conversations with Mrs. Chen, could understand basic instructions without gestures, could read some words though the alphabet still confused her. One afternoon in late July, Mrs. Chen asked her a question in careful English. "Harumi, do you have family in Japan?" Harumi nodded. "Mother, brother." Mrs. Chen pulled out the photograph of David again. "Family is precious. This war has taken so many. I hope your mother and brother survive." The kindness in her voice made Harumi's throat tighten. Then came the announcement that changed everything. Late July, a notice was posted outside the administration building. Harumi translated it for the other women, her voice shaking slightly. "Male Japanese prisoners of war being transferred to Camp Shelby. They will be housed separately but in same compound. Integration for certain activities to begin in coming weeks." The reactions were immediate and intense. Some women felt hope. Maybe they would find brothers, cousins, friends. Maybe they would get news from home. Maybe they would feel less alone. Others felt terror. Male officers meant military hierarchy, meant the old rules, meant at judgment for the crime of survival. Harumi felt both. Part of her wanted news of the war of Japan, of anything familiar. But another part feared what those men would think of women who had surrendered, who had dropped the capsule, who had chosen life. "They are going to call us cowards," Sachiko said quietly. "Let them," Midori replied. "We survived. That is what matters." But Tomoko looked almost triumphant. Finally someone will restore order and honor. Finally someone will remind these traitors what Japanese women should be. The next few days passed in anxious waiting. Work continued, routines persisted, but underneath everything was a current of tension. The men were coming, everything was about to change. Then on August 15th, news arrived that shattered what remained of the old world. Japan had surrendered. The radio announcement reached camp at midday. Emperor Hirohito's voice, the first time most Japanese people had ever heard their emperor speak. His words were formal, archaic, hard to understand. But the meaning was clear. The war was over. Japan had accepted unconditional surrender. The reaction in the women's barracks was chaos. Some collapsed sobbing with relief that the dying would finally stop. Others wailed with the shame of defeat. Tomoko rocked back and forth, repeating, "No, no, no, this cannot be. We never surrender, we die first." Sachiko sat very still, her face blank. "It is finally over," she said to no one in particular. "The dying can stop." Harumi felt numb. Kenji would not have to fly his mission. Mother might survive. Japan would not be invaded. That was good. That was relief beyond measure. But Japan had surrendered. The unthinkable had happened. And what did that mean for them? Would they be executed for the crime of surviving? Would they be sent home to a destroyed country? Would they be kept in America forever? No one had answers. Just fear and relief and confusion all mixed together into something that had no name. 3 days later, on August 18th, the male prisoners arrived. Harumi woke to the sound of trucks, male voices shouting in Japanese, boots tramping across the compound, gates clanging. Through the gaps in the barracks walls, she could see men in prisoner clothing, heads shaved, faces gaunt, but still fierce. Even in defeat, they maintained military bearing. Even in captivity, they carried themselves like soldiers. That day felt endless. The women worked their shifts, but everyone's attention was elsewhere. What would happen? When would they see the men? What would the men say to them? The announcement came at dinner. Tomorrow, Sunday, there would be a Catholic Mass. All prisoners invited. First official gathering of male and female prisoners. Attendance optional, but encouraged. That night, Harumi could not sleep. Neither could anyone else. The barracks buzzed with whispered conversations. Anxiety, dread, hope, fear. Tomoko was almost giddy with anticipation. Finally proper order would be restored. Finally men who remembered honor, who would set things right. Sachiko looked at Harumi across the darkness. "Are you ready for this?" Harumi thought about Captain Yoshida, about the officers she had seen through the barracks walls, about men who had been taught the same lies she had been taught, about men who might still believe those lies. "No," she said honestly, "but it is happening anyway." Sunday morning she woke to gray light and the sound of her own heart hammering. She dressed carefully in her cotton dress. looked at herself in the small mirror near the door. Who was she now, the obedient girl who had believed everything, the coward who had dropped the capsule, the survivor who was learning English and eating bacon and choosing life? She did not know, but in 2 hours she would face men who thought they had the answer, men who would judge her, men who would call her a traitor, and somewhere among those men would be Captain Yoshida, walking toward them across the dusty courtyard, his face carved from stone, his voice condemning them, and American soldiers would step between them, would form a wall, would say no, would prove that mercy could come from unexpected places, would prove that the world was not what anyone had been taught, would prove that sometimes the enemy was the protector and your own people were the threat. In 2 hours, everything would change again. In 2 hours, Harumi Tanaka would understand what real courage looked like. And it would not look like death. It would look like an American sergeant planting himself between a Japanese officer and the women he wanted to punish. It would look like mercy standing firm against hate. It would look like the moment everything she thought she knew shattered completely. 2 hours, that was all the time she had left. Sunday morning, August 19th, 1945. Harumi woke before the bugle call, her heart already racing. Today she would face the men. Today she would learn what they thought of women who had chosen life over death. Today everything would change again. The other women were already stirring. No one had slept well. The barracks was filled with the quiet sounds of anxiety, breathing that came too fast, whispers that cut off mid-sentence, the rustle of dresses being pulled on with shaking hands. Harumi splashed water on her face, looked at herself in the small mirror. Her face was thinner than it had been in April. Her eyes looked older. She barely recognized the girl who had believed everything her country told her. That girl was gone. In her place was someone else, someone harder, someone who had seen too much to ever be innocent again. They were ordered to the main courtyard for the Catholic Mass. Attendance was optional, the American Guard said, but most of the women went, driven by curiosity or dread or simply the need to break the monotony of waiting. The courtyard was large and dusty, surrounded by barracks on three sides. The morning sun beat down, already promising another sweltering Mississippi day. A small platform had been erected at one end where a chaplain would conduct the service. The men were already there when the women arrived. They stood in neat ranks on one side of the courtyard. Even in prisoner clothing, even stripped of weapons and insignia, they looked like soldiers. Back straight, eyes forward. Military discipline so ingrained it persisted even in defeat. Harumi scanned their faces as the women filed in. She saw no one she recognized, but what she did see made her stomach clench. The expressions, hard, judgmental, full of contempt, barely concealed. These men looked at the women like they were traitors, like they were less than human, like they were shameful creatures who had failed the most basic test of honor. The women formed their own ranks on the opposite side of the courtyard. The space between them felt enormous, a gulf that was not just physical but moral, philosophical, a divide between those who believed death was honor and those who had chosen to survive. American guards stood around the perimeter. Sergeant Wilson was there, his face neutral but watchful. Other soldiers held rifles loosely, not expecting trouble, but ready if it came. The camp commander, Colonel Anderson, stood near the platform, observing everything with the calm efficiency of a career officer. The Catholic chief's chaplain stepped onto the platform. He was an older man with gray hair and kind eyes. He wore the uniform of an army chaplain with a cross on his collar. He began to speak in English, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Harumi understood only fragments. Something about peace, about forgiveness, about brotherhood. The words felt hollow. How could there be brotherhood between people who hated each other? How could there be forgiveness when the wounds were so fresh? A translator stood beside the chaplain, rendering his words into halting Japanese. The service proceeded. Prayers in Latin that neither side fully understood. Hymns sung in English that the Japanese prisoners could not follow. The whole thing felt surreal. Japanese prisoners worshiping alongside their captors in the middle of Mississippi, pretending for 1 hour that the war had not happened, that they were not enemies, that everything was normal. Harumi heard none of it. She was too aware of the men's stares, too conscious of their judgment pressing down on her like a physical weight. She stood with her back straight and her eyes forward, trying to look like she was not terrified, trying to look like she belonged here, trying to look like she had nothing to be ashamed of. But shame sat in her chest like a stone, because part of her still believed what those men believed. Part of her still thought she should have taken the capsule. Part of her still wondered if survival was cowardice. The service lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, the chaplain dismissed them with a blessing. Go in peace. But there would be no peace. As the women turned to go back to their barracks, a voice cut through the courtyard. Sharp, commanding, unmistakably military. Women of the Empire, stand at attention, the voice came from one of the male officers. He stepped forward from the ranks flanked by two others. He was perhaps 32 years old, thin as a skeleton. His face was all angles and shadows. His eyes were completely dead. This was Captain Yoshida. Years of training took over. Some women snapped to attention automatically, bodies responding before minds could object. Others froze confused. Harumi stood paralyzed, her body remembering how to obey even as her mind screamed warnings. Young Akiko began to cry, immediately terrified sobs that she tried to muffle with her hands. Yoshida began to walk toward them. His movements were slow and deliberate. Each step was a statement. Each step said, I have authority here. Each step said, you will answer to me. He began to speak. His voice was formal and damning. Each word landed like a blow. Women of the Empire, look at yourselves. You wear the clothes of the enemy. You eat the food of the enemy. You serve the enemy willingly. You have brought shame to Japan. You have dishonored your families. You have failed in your duty to the emperor. He paused, letting the words sink in like poison. You were given the means to preserve your honor. You were given the capsule, the path of dignity, the path of courage. And you refused. You chose cowardice over bravery. You chose life over honor. You chose survival over duty. Do you understand what you are? You are traitors. You are less than women. You are less than human. Each word struck like a physical blow. Harumi felt her chest tightening, felt old shame and old guilt rising to choke her. Around her, women began to tremble. Some started crying, not quiet tears, deep guttural sobs that came from a place beyond reason. A girl to Harumi's left dropped to her knees wailing, and then the screaming started. It erupted from somewhere in the group of women. Not just one voice, but many, screaming that was primal and terrified, screaming that needed no translation. The sound of absolute terror, the sound of women who understood that their commanders had come to enforce the old rules, to punish them for the crime of survival, to remind them that even here, even in America, even in captivity, the code still bound them. The code that said death was better than surrender. The code they had broken. Some women collapsed completely. Others clutched each other, their bodies shaking violently. Tomoko was on the ground, keening like a wounded animal, saying over and over, I am sorry, I wanted to take it. I tried. Yoshida and the two officers with him kept walking forward. They were perhaps 20 feet from the women now, close enough that Harumi could see the coldness in Yoshida's eyes, close enough to hear his voice cutting through the screams. You will be held accountable. You will answer for your cowardice. You will face judgment. The women believed him, because in their world, officers had absolute power. Officers decided who lived and who died. Officers could order you to take poison, and you would do it because that was what duty demanded. And then the American soldiers moved. It happened fast. The guards who had been at the perimeter snapped into action, not drawing their weapons, not threatening anyone, but gripping their rifles firmly as they stepped between the advancing male officers and the terrified women. They formed a line, a wall, American bodies standing between Japanese men and Japanese women. Sergeant Wilson planted himself directly in Yoshida's path. Wilson was taller, broader, younger. His face was set with calm determination. He spoke with quiet finality. That is far enough. Then in rough but understandable Japanese, Dame Hikamasan. No, you cannot go, Yoshida halted, first confused, then enraged. His face twisted with emotions that cycled too fast to name. Shock, humiliation, fury. He barked orders in Japanese that Wilson did not understand, but the intent was obvious. Step aside, let me pass. These women are mine to discipline. Wilson did not move. The other American guards held their line, rifles angled across their chests. Not threatening, but immovable. The message was unmistakable. The women were under American protection. Japanese military hierarchy no longer applied here. The two officers with Yoshida joined him, shouting demands. Some of the male prisoners began moving forward, ready to back their officers. The tension ratcheted higher. American guards tensed hands, shifting on weapons. This could turn violent. This could become a riot. And then Colonel Anderson arrived. He strode into the courtyard with the translator at his side, took in the scene with one sweeping glance, saw Japanese male officers confronting a line of American guards, saw women collapsed on the ground screaming and crying, understood exactly what was happening. His voice cut through the chaos like a knife. Calm, authoritative, absolute. The translator began rendering his words into Japanese even as he spoke them. In this camp, you are all prisoners of the United States Army. There is no rank. There is no chain of command. There is only one authority. Mine. You will not harass these women. You will not threaten them. You will not speak to them without my permission. Is that understood? Yoshida tried to argue. His voice shook with rage and something deeper. Desperation. These women have dishonored themselves. They must answer to Japanese military justice. They violated the code. They deserve punishment. You do not understand our ways, our honor system. Anderson's response was measured and final. I understand that these women are under my protection. I understand that American law protects prisoners of war from each other. I understand that if you violate my orders, you will spend the rest of your time here in isolation. Do you understand? The last three words were spaced for emphasis, each one a hammer blow. For a long moment, Yoshida stood frozen. His face cycled through emotions: rage, humiliation, disbelief, and then something else, something breaking. Because he was a man who had commanded 200 soldiers, a man who had survived Saipan when every one of his men died, a man who had clung to the Bushido code as the only thing that kept him human in an inhuman world. And now he had no power, no authority, no purpose, just another prisoner, equal to the women he despised, stripped of everything that had defined him. At Anderson's signal, American guards moved forward to escort the male prisoners back to their barracks. As Yoshida turned to go, his eyes swept over the women one last time. Harumi met his gaze. What she saw shocked her. Yes, there was hatred. Yes, there was fury, but underneath was something else. Grief, loss, a kind of hollow devastation. Because if the code did not matter anymore, what did he have left? What had all his sacrifice been for? What meaning did his survival have? He was not just angry, he was broken. Broken by the same system that had tried to break her. The same lies, the same impossible demands, the same code that required death as the only form of honor. In that moment, Harumi understood. Yoshida was not her enemy. Not really. He was another victim, damaged beyond repair by a system that had failed everyone it touched. The male prisoners were led away. The courtyard fell silent except for the sound of women crying. Slowly they began to pick themselves up from the ground, trembling but safe, traumatized but alive. Wilson approached carefully, aware they were terrified. His Japanese was clumsy but sincere. You are safe now. The translator explained more fully. American law protects prisoners of war from each other. The male prisoners cannot hurt you. Rank means nothing here. You are all equal under American military law. It seemed impossible, but they had just watched it happen, had watched American soldiers physically block Japanese officers, had watched an American commander override Japanese military hierarchy, had watched the old rules collapse in the face of new ones. That night, the women's barracks was a place of whispered chaos, everyone trying to process what had happened, what it meant, what they had become. Tomoko was in her bunk facing the wall, silent. For the first time since they had been captured, she had nothing to say. The officers had come, the men who were supposed to restore order and honor, and they had been stopped. By Americans, by the enemy, by people who were supposed to be monsters. Everything she had believed had been proven false in front of her eyes, and she had no words for what that felt like. Sachiko sat with Harumi on her bunk. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Harumi found words. He was broken. Captain Yoshida, did you see his face? Sachiko nodded. They broke him, not the Americans. His own people, his own code. He gave everything to something that failed him, and now he has nothing left. That is the real tragedy, Midori said quietly from her bunk. Not that we survived, that they cannot forgive us for surviving, that their entire sense of self requires us to have died. The barracks fell silent, each woman alone with her thoughts, with the enormity of what had happened, with the realization that they had just witnessed something profound, the old world colliding with the new, and the new world winning. The next day, new rules were posted. Male and female prisoners would be kept strictly separated except for supervised work details. No interaction without explicit permission. Guards were doubled around the women's barracks. Wilson was specifically assigned to ensure their safety. Life at Camp Shelby settled into a new rhythm. Work, meals, routine. But everything felt different now. The women walked with their heads a little higher, spoke a little more freely. The fear that had haunted them since capture had lifted somewhat. Not gone, but lighter. Harumi's relationship with Mrs. Chen deepened after the confrontation. One afternoon, Mrs. Chen asked through careful English and gestures, "Why did the Japanese officer want to hurt you?" Harumi struggled to explain in her limited English. Finally, she mimed taking something, putting it to her mouth. Poison. Mrs. Chen's eyes widened in understanding. "We were supposed to die. Instead, we lived. He thinks we are cowards." Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. She wrote slowly using simple words that Harumi could understand with the help of a dictionary. "In America, we believe every person has rights, even prisoners, even enemies. These rights come from God, not from government or military. No one can take them away. This is what makes America different. Not that we are always good, but that we try to protect dignity for everyone." She showed Harumi a poster on the wall. The American Constitution pointed to words Harumi could not fully read. All men are created equal. This means everyone deserves respect. Everyone deserves protection. Even you. Even now. Harumi felt tears burning in her eyes. In Japan, your worth came from your place in the hierarchy, from your obedience to authority, from your willingness to sacrifice. But here Mrs. Chen was saying something revolutionary, that she had worth simply because she was human, that she deserved protection simply because she existed. It was a radical idea, and it was saving her life. In November, a letter arrived from Japan. Harumi's hands shook as she opened it. The last she had heard from her mother was in May before she was captured. 7 months ago, an eternity. The letter was dated October, written after the surrender. Her mother's handwriting was shaky but recognizable. "Dearest Harumi, if this letter finds you, Japan has surrendered. The war is over. Kenji is alive. He never flew his mission. The surrender came before his unit was deployed. He is home now. Quiet, changed, but alive. The Americans are here, occupying Japan. We were terrified. We hid what little we had. We expected monsters based on what we were told during the war. But they came with food, with medicine, with supplies we desperately needed. They are treating us kindly, like human beings. Everything we were told was lies. Everything. I understand now why you survived. I am glad you did. Come home when you can. We will rebuild. We will not repeat the lies. Your loving mother." Harumi read the letter 3 times. Then she showed it to Sachiko, who read it and nodded slowly. Both sides, she said. Both sides learning the same truth at the same time. The propaganda was lies. On both sides. And the people are just people. Trying to survive. Trying to be decent. Harumi took the letter to Mrs. Chen. Showed her translating the key parts into English. "My mother says the same thing to learn. Americans are not monsters. They are showing mercy." Mrs. Chen smiled. "Then maybe there is hope. For all of us. Maybe the next generation will not have to fight this war again." December brought something unexpected. The Americans announced they would celebrate Christmas and invited the Japanese prisoners to participate. Many refused, Tomoko among them. But Harumi, Sachiko, Midori, and young Akiko attended. The mess hall was decorated with evergreen branches and red ribbons. There was a Christmas tree with lights and tinsel. American soldiers and Japanese prisoners stood together awkwardly, at first, then with growing ease. Each prisoner was given a small gift. Harumi opened hers to find an English-Japanese dictionary. Inside the cover, Mrs. Chen had written in careful English, "Enemies are just friends we have not met yet." Margaret Chen, December 45. Harumi clutched the book to her chest. It was the most precious thing she owned, more valuable than gold, because it represented possibility. The possibility that understanding could replace hatred, that communication could build bridges, that even after the worst war in human history, people could choose mercy. There was food, ham and potatoes and rolls, and something called pumpkin pie that was sweet and strange and wonderful. There were carols. Harumi did not know the words, but she hummed along the melodies, foreign but somehow comforting. Sergeant Wilson approached her carefully. "Merry Christmas," he said. Harumi repeated the words, testing them. "Merry Christmas," he smiled. "Your English is very good now." "Thank you. You teach me." "No, you taught yourself. I just helped." It was a small moment, a brief conversation, but it represented something larger. Two people from countries that had been trying to kill each other speaking across the divide, finding common ground, choosing connection over hatred. Spring came to Mississippi with a burst of green and warmth. In April of 1946, nearly a year after Harumi's capture, the announcement came. Japanese prisoners would be repatriated, sent home. Transport ships were being prepared. The women had mixed feelings. They wanted to see their families, wanted to go home. But Camp Shelby had become a strange kind of home too. A safe place. A place where they had learned difficult truths and rebuilt broken selves. The final goodbyes were harder than Harumi expected. Mrs. Chen gave her an envelope. Inside was a letter of recommendation written in English. "For when you teach English in Japan, you will be a good teacher. You have learned not just language, but understanding. That is what the world needs now." They hugged, breaking the rules about prisoner and guard contact, but neither cared. "You saved me," Harumi said in English. "No, you saved yourself. I just showed you it was possible." Sergeant Wilson gave her something small, an American flag patch. "So you remember, not all enemies stay enemies." Harumi took it carefully. "Thank you for standing between us and them. Thank you for showing me what courage really looks like." Wilson's eyes were bright. Just doing what is right. That is all any of us can do. The last night at Camp Shelby, the women gathered in their barracks one final time. They talked late into the night about what they had learned, about who they had become, about what they would tell people back home. "Are you ready to go back?" Sachiko asked Harumi. "No, but I am ready to tell the truth." "They will not want to hear it." "I know, but I will tell them anyway." May 1946, Yokohama. The city was destroyed, ruins everywhere. Buildings reduced to rubble, streets lined with debris. But people were rebuilding, clearing wreckage, planting gardens, trying to create life from destruction. Harumi's mother waited at the dock. She looked years older, thin and worn, but alive. They embraced and both cried. Kenji was there too, gaunt, silent, his eyes holding ghosts that would never fully leave. They wanted to know everything. What was it like? Were you treated well? Did they hurt you? Harumi told them everything. The cyanide capsule, the capture, the voyage, Camp Shelby, the food, Mrs. Chen and her dead son David, Captain Yoshida and the confrontation, the American soldiers who stood between her and death, the dictionary and the flag patch, and all the small moments of mercy. Her mother believed immediately. She had seen American occupation, had experienced their mercy firsthand, but Kenji struggled. They treated you well, but we were told they were monsters. Everything we were told was lies, Harumi said gently. Kenji looked at his hands. Then what was it all for? All the men who died, all the missions, all the sacrifice. If they were not monsters, why did we fight? Harumi had no answer for that. Perhaps there was no good answer. Perhaps that was the tragedy, that so many had died for lies, had sacrificed for propaganda, had believed so deeply in something false. Harumi became an English teacher, used the dictionary Mrs. Chen gave her. Taught students not just grammar and vocabulary, but context. Why Americans wrote what they wrote, what democracy meant, what individual rights meant, what it meant to choose mercy over revenge. Students sometimes asked her why she taught the language of the enemy. She would pull out the flag patch Wilson had given her. Hold it up. Because understanding each other is how we prevent the next war. Because the enemy is just someone you have not understood yet. Because mercy is stronger than hate. She taught for 30 years. Married a man who had also survived the war, who understood what trauma looked like. They had 2 children, 4 grandchildren. Built a quiet life from the ruins of everything they had lost. She never forgot Camp Shelby. Never forgot Mrs. Chen or Wilson or Sachiko or the women who screamed. Never forgot Captain Yoshida's broken face. Never forgot the moment American soldiers formed a wall and said no. Some debts cannot be repaid, only remembered, only honored, only passed forward. 1985, 40 years after the war ended. Harumi was 60 years old. She traveled to Okinawa for a peace memorial ceremony, a gathering to honor all who had died in the battle, Japanese and American, soldiers and civilians, everyone consumed by that terrible spring of 45. She stood among the crowd listening to speeches about reconciliation and peace, and then she saw him, an American man, older now, gray-haired, but she recognized him immediately. Sergeant Wilson. Their eyes met across the decades. Recognition was instant, mutual. They moved toward each other through the crowd. Sergeant Wilson, she said in English. Miss Tanaka. His voice was older but kind as she remembered. They embraced, not awkwardly, not hesitantly, like old friends who had survived something terrible together. You taught me English, she said. You taught me something more important. That mercy matters. That choosing to protect someone matters, even when it is hard, even when they are supposed to be the enemy. They stood together, 2 old survivors watching the ceremony. After a while, Wilson spoke again. I think about that day sometimes, in the courtyard, when your officer wanted to punish you all. I think about it every day, Harumi said. You stood between us. You said no. You showed me that courage is not dying when told to die. Courage is standing up when everyone expects you to step aside. They were quiet for a moment. Then Wilson said softly, do you ever regret surviving? Harumi thought about that, about the capsule, about the choice her body made when her mind could not, about 40 years of life she would not have had if her fingers had obeyed. No, I do not regret it. I have children, grandchildren, students who learn from me. A life. Survival was not shame. It was the first act of rebuilding. Wilson nodded. I am glad you lived. I am glad we stood between you and them that day. It was the right thing to do. Some walls are meant to be stood behind, Harumi said. Others are meant to protect. That is beautiful, Wilson said. Where did you hear that? I just thought of it now. But it is true. Your wall protected me, gave me time to heal, time to understand, time to become who I am now. The ceremony ended. They exchanged addresses, promised to write, hugged one more time. Then Wilson walked away into the crowd and Harumi watched him go. She lived another 26 years, died peacefully in 2011 at the age of 85, surrounded by family. Her last words were in English. Thank you for standing between us, because some debts can never be repaid, only remembered, only honored, only passed forward to the next generation so they know. Mercy heals what hatred breaks, every single time. The war taught Harumi Tanaka what hate could destroy, but Camp Shelby taught her what mercy could build. Sometimes humanity comes from where you least expect it. Sometimes the enemy becomes the protector. And sometimes in choosing to save the life of someone you are supposed to hate, you save yourself too. Harumi carried that lesson home to a defeated Japan. She taught it to her children, to her students, to anyone who would listen. And the world became in small ways a little bit better because she chose to live, because she chose to learn, because she chose to pass forward to the mercy she received. That is the story of Harumi Tanaka. That is the story of mercy triumphing over hate. That is the story America needs to remember. Not that we are perfect, not that we always get it right, but that when we choose mercy, when we protect the vulnerable, when we say no to hatred and yes to human dignity, we become who we are meant to be. Some walls divide, Others protect. 40 years after the war, Harumi stood with the man who had built a wall to protect her. And they understood in that moment that the world was healed not by the people who demanded death, but by the people who chose life, by the people who stood between terror and the terrified, by the people who said no when everyone expected yes, by the people who chose mercy even when mercy seemed impossible. That is how wars end, not with surrender documents, not with ceremonies, but with moments of grace. With small choices to be kind when cruelty would be easier. With walls that protect instead of divide. Harumi Tanaka lived that truth. And her story remains a reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, compassion endures. That even when the world demands death, life can be chosen. That even when everything you have been taught is a lie, truth can be learned. And that mercy offered freely and without condition heals what hatred breaks. Every single time. Without exception. Forever.